So I've been having a bit of a back and forth in PMs with someone who's claiming that America is the strongest nation on earth because of how religious it is. Now, for those of you who don't know, there's this interesting pattern on earth where the richer a country is, the less likely it is to be highly religious. Like countries in the European Union, or like Australia, or Canada, or New Zealand, Japan, anything like that. And if they're more impoverished, like in South America or in Africa, then they're more likely to be religious. But there is one exception to this, and that is America. America is highly religious. Obviously, a lot of our policymakers are highly religious, but we're also one of the richest countries on earth. We're also in a lot of debt, but you got to remember that we're better off than the vast majority of people in the world still. And this person said that that is because of how religious the people in this country are. It's like basically America is now God's chosen people, and because we're so steadfast to Him, that's why we're growing. And the reasons why we're in these problems now with our country and our economy and such is because we're turning away from religion, and that is the source cause. And basically, I wanted to describe the conversation that I've had and share my points, because I think it's worth hearing in case if you have someone argue this against you. And it's fine if someone is religious, that's fine. People can have their own perspectives, but it bothers me when I hear someone say that something is the absolute truth and you must adhere to it or you're wrong. There are plenty of cases like this. Like there's an infamous quote by Chuck Norris where he said that if he became president, he would take every atheist in the country and tattoo the words "In God We Trust" on their forehead and such. A bunch of stupid stuff like that. But it is true that U.S. is one country that is different from the rest of the first world countries in that it's highly religious despite being rich. But there is also another difference, and that is the U.S. tends to function as a hegemon in the world. If you don't know what a hegemon is, basically, it's one country that has a significant amount of influence over other countries. Whether it's more like in the olden days and they have military power like Great Britain, or they have a significant amount of economic power. Whatever it is, they're basically on the top, and other countries have to worry about them. And that's basically the U.S. right now. We're the one country on top. Some people are afraid we'll be overthrown in that regard by China, but I don't see that happening in the near future. For now, we're number one, and we're pretty comfortable there. But how did we get there? Did we just sort of say, we're going to be hegemons, and everybody's like, okay? No. Now, as I said, Great Britain was the hegemon for a long time, but eventually they, along with all the other Europeans, fell. Why did they fall? They fell because of World War II. And World War II was one of the most devastating wars that happened in recent history. It pretty much destroyed them. It was so intense, it used up so many resources, and it pretty much all happened in Europe, excluding the part with Japan. Like in terms of like the Germans and the Nazis fighting and everything, that almost all took place in Europe, specifically Western Europe. It pretty much destroyed France, it destroyed Great Britain, it pretty much destroyed Germany by the end of it, and obviously a lot of the Eastern Europe was messed up too. They did extend pretty far east. They even went into Russia at one point. They killed a lot of people, like I think 20 million people, but it's so big and the population is so dispersed out that they weren't able to do much harm to it. And even though Hitler did have a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, he broke that. So that launched them into war against them. The Russians were fighting the Germans. And then the US eventually came in and fought the Germans because Japan bombed us in Pearl Harbor. We declared war on them, or them on us, I forget which way. But since we were in war with them and Hitler had a pact with Japan, Germany declared war on the US. So we fought, and Russia fought, but the majority of that wasn't on our domestic landscape. It wasn't on our soil. It was all in Western Europe, and Western Europe was the power until that point, but they all were destroyed, basically. And at the end of the World War II, we were left with two major powers, the US and the Soviet Union. And obviously, people always want power. You don't want to say, okay, I got some, they got some, we're all good. What you want to say is, I'm number one, and you want to be comfortable in that. And this is still in an era where a lot of the power is based on land and how much you can scare people. Nowadays, more about the economy, but back then, it was about how much power you had. And we had the nuclear bombs, and they were developing it, we were scared, they were scared of us, and everything was crazy. So we had the Cold War, which is an interesting war because it was a war where neither side actually attacked each other. The US never attacked Russia, Russia never attacked the US, but we fought each other through third parties. Like we went to war with Vietnam, and there was some revolution in Hungary, I believe, where they were trying to revolt against the Soviet Union, but they fought them as a symbol, saying don't mess with the communists. There were several examples of that, but there weren't a lot of examples, or actually there weren't any examples of them fighting directly with each other. It was all a mind game. It was all about the mentality of it. And the number one way to win a mental game is to mess with the heads of the people that you're ruling over. Make them hate the other side. A lot of propaganda went into both sides. Like on Russia, they obviously had a lot of propaganda, but in the US we did too. We painted them as being evil and horrible and just destroying the world. We had this image of the Iron Curtain, that they're trying to break through and take over the whole world, but we put up this Iron Curtain that they can't get through to protect us. Now, one big aspect of the deal with propaganda is how small the differences between people are. You might look at someone who you've never seen before and say, wow, they're really different. But in reality, people at our core are pretty similar. We really are. We want the same things. We want to have food and shelter, obviously. We want to find love in our lives. We want to pursue our passions. We want to have financial security. We have different ways of doing that. But at our core, there aren't a lot of differences between people. Propaganda has the job of finding those few differences and exploiting them and exploding them, making them as big as they can possibly be, showing the world how different they are from you, how different you are from them, and making it very easy to make them enemies. And there are several ways we did that, but one big one, the obvious one, was communism. We were capitalists, and they were the communists, and we fought them because of that. So, like, they're so different from us. They're destroying our way of life. And it started the slippery slope of assumptions and just mentalities. You know, they were communists, so with communism comes socialism, with socialism comes liberalism, with liberalism comes secularism, and with secularism, of course, comes atheism. In a lot of propaganda against the Soviets, we weren't talking about their policies, the way they treated people, or any of the horrible stuff they were doing. We talked about how they were godless heathens, and how they wanted to destroy us. And that became a part of the mentality that we fought against them with. I can specifically remember watching a documentary on PBS. I don't remember the name. I'll look it up and I'll link it if I can remember it. But it was talking about this type of mentality, and it was showing a clip from one propaganda movie where a man wakes up in his nightmare and he goes downstairs and he sees his children, and they're talking about how they're disappointed with the way he raised them and they want to be raised properly, so they're going off to a state school in the Soviet Union, I assume. But he's like, no, you aren't doing that. You've been brainwashed by the commies, and I'm going to fix you right now. He grabs their hands like, what are you doing? Come with me now. We're going to Sunday school. And that's the mentality. You know, if you have a problem with their morality or their issues or their lives, you take them to Sunday school, because the communists, the Soviets, they weren't religious. That makes them different from us, and that makes it easy to show that difference. They were not religious, so we made it part of our identity to become religious. That's why in that era, we started making religiosity much more prevalent in our society. That's when we put "In God We Trust" on the money and "One Nation Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. You know, during that era, that's when this happened. And that really explains the mentality of people from that era. It also explains why so many people are afraid of government intervention, like liberalism, I guess. People oppose it for different reasons, but you'll notice that there's a specific demographic of really old people who fall into a specific age category of like the 60s or 70s or 80s. These are people who were brought up during a time when this was going on. Like, there were little children, maybe young adults. Like, my grandpa has a lot of these mentalities still, and he's like 80 or so. So when you take that into account, like back in the 40s and 50s, he would have been about 10 or 20. The Cold War, World War II stopped at 1945, so beyond that and into the 50s, that was the main time it was going on, and that was when he was growing up. And people in this demographic were growing up in that time too. So that's why they have a lot of these mentalities. It's a part of the propaganda. And propaganda really sticks with people. If you have a war that's going on for a few years and you give them propaganda, that helps you now. But that mentality doesn't go away even after the war is done. Like in World War II, we were fighting Japan. And Japan painted us as horrible imperialists who were destroying the world. I have a friend who went to Japan for a while, and he actually speaks Japanese, and he's very integrated into the culture, even though he's white. And there are a few times he told me about being on the subway where he saw really old people saying basically racial slurs against him and talking about how he's horrible and greedy and people like him are destroying the culture of Japan and such. That was part of the propaganda mentality that they spread, and that stuff sticks. it explains a lot of the mentalities that people from that time period had. And one of them is the religiosity. That's one major thing. Like, you would see a lot of parades against the communists, and they would hold up signs with God's name in them. That's just part of the mentality. And that's why people in this culture are so afraid to step away from that type of mentality, because it's been ingrained into our culture, even though it's not really relevant anymore. Well, it is to a certain degree, because obviously if the mentality exists, people are going to pick up on it. Like, this is going to be bipartisan, sorry, but like Republicans obviously drilling in how hard the left is declaring a war on religion and a war on Christmas, and use that as an advantage to get higher tax breaks for upper bracket income individuals. And if you say that that's the group that's for Jesus and the other is opposed to religion, that really helps your cause out a lot. And that really feeds the mentality that people have. If you've been taught from birth that this is the way things should be, or taught from the age of reason, it's going to stick with you. And that's the reason why we are who we are. We're the hegemon because eventually we beat out the Soviets because we had a stronger economic system. But the religiosity was just part of the mentality we used as propaganda during that era. Whether you're religious or not, it says nothing about the economy of your country. It says nothing about your character or your morality. It just doesn't have anything to do with anything. It was just a tactic that people used to advance their position. They aren't connected with each other. We're the leading force because we beat out the Soviets. And we're highly religious, and we have the mentalities we do because of the propaganda that we used against them that is now irrelevant, and people should think on their own and arrive at their own conclusions. And if you arrive at different conclusions, that's cool. But feeding into the old propaganda mentality, you know, that's not any part of a system. That's just you doing what your culture teaches you. And it bothers me when people can't think beyond that. Anyways, that's my opinion on it. So let me know what you think. Do you have any disagreement opinions? Have I said anything wrong? Let me know what's going on. Have a nice day.